Hi guys, we're live. Kanina pa.
Okay. And we are live. Welcome to the pilot at Talk of the Town, a web series presented by PinoyLife.net, your lifestyle and knowledge sharing channel. Talk of the Town will feature various topics that is current and important to us in our towns, cities, and communities we live in. Our pilot episode features the topic America is in the Heart, an online discussion on the history of Filipino migration to the U.S. and Filipinos in America today. Our online discussion is brought to you by PinoyLife.net, Design District Studios LLC, the Philippine Daily Mirror, and Law Office of Cristina Godinez. Please welcome our host, newspaper publisher, trainer, and co-founder of Pinoy Life. Please welcome Ricky Rillera.
Thank you very much, and welcome to our pilot episode of Talk of the Town. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I am Ricky Rillera, your host and moderator for tonight's episode. Let's welcome my sidekick co-host, Antero Nair Martinez. I'm so excited to be with you tonight, Nair.
Oh, thank you very much, Ricky. It is truly my pleasure to be here. Congratulations to all of us here at PinoyLife.net. We made it to our pilot episode. I believe we have an exciting episode tonight. Ricky, can you enlighten us on what it is?
Well, of course. Tonight, our topic is America is in the Heart. We are honored and privileged to have as premier guests in our show tonight two of the most respected personalities in the community. A professor of Filipino and Philippine history and literature, and an immigration attorney. In their college days and even now, they have been invited separately in their speaking engagements. But tonight, for the first time, they are both in the same show as resource speakers, a truly husband and wife team. They will be appropriately introduced later. Hi, Noel. Hi, Chris. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Ricky. It's great to be here.
Hey, Ricky. Thanks for having me.
Wow. All right. Are you all excited to be here tonight?
Yes, of course.
Yes.
Is America in the heart? Take note of the question mark. Our guest presenters will talk about the history of Filipino migration and the current state of migration in the U.S. and how it has affected Filipino-Americans. I believe it is a timely topic, being that last month, October, is Filipino-American History Month. I am confident our presenters will certainly touch the hearts and minds of our viewers, Filipino or not. Noel and Chris, would you care to explain why it is a question in America is in the heart?
Our title is actually our way of paying homage to Carlos Bulosan, a Filipino immigrant, a Manong, who came to the U.S. in the 1920s and 1930s, and he wrote about the struggles and racism and racial discrimination that the Filipino Manongs suffered at the hands of white farm workers and farmers. And also the question mark is in a way our way of encouraging our fellow Filipino Americans to take a look, to review our history of migration here in the United States.
Chris?
Well, the question mark. The original title of Carlos Bulosan's book doesn't have a question mark, and we put a question mark there because typically it's supposed to denote uncertainty or doubt. But in this case, we would like to spin that uncertainty or doubt into something more positive and probably spark conversation about the Filipino-American experience. And hopefully we embark on a journey of self-discovery as a group in the United States.
Wow. Those are quite insightful answers. So, Ricky, why don't we get the ball rolling? Our comment box is live. And to our viewers, feel free to type in your questions and our presenters will have time to answer them during our Q&A session after their presentation. So, Ricky, let's introduce our first presenter.
All right. Okay. To start off, Noel Pangilinan teaches Filipino and Philippine history and literature at the College of Mount St. Vincent, the alma mater of former Philippine President Corazon Aquino. He also taught Filipino at Rutgers University and Filipino-American literature at the City University of New York, Hunter College. Noel also taught Philippine history and literature and journalism at the University of the Philippines, UP Diliman, and Cebu.
And to add to that, Ricky, Noel also worked as a journalist for major newspapers in Manila and was the editor-in-chief of the English language daily newspaper, The Freeman in Cebu City. At present, he is senior editor at the Asian American Writers Workshop. He is also a regular lecturer with the Filipino School of New York and New Jersey. Noel, you're on!
Good evening. Magandang gabi at magandang umaga to those who are tuned in the Philippines. Did you know that Filipinos are the fourth largest immigrant group in the United States? As of 2018, there are about 4 million Filipinos in the United States. How did this happen? How can a country so far, more than 8,000 miles away, have this much population here in the US? To better understand this reality, we need to go back to the turn of the 20th century. This many Filipinos living in the United States is a situation born out of the long-running relationship between the US and the Philippines. The diaspora of Filipinos to the US was largely dictated by the needs and imposition of the more powerful of the two, the United States, and the acquiescence of the smaller of the two, the Philippines. 433 years ago, on October 18, 1587, it is said that the first Filipinos landed in the continental Americas. On that day, a Spanish galleon landed at what is now Morro Bay in California. The captain's log mentioned the presence of Luzones Indios among the ship's crew. The crew explored the land but had to abandon their mission 3 days later after they were attacked by the natives of the land. 3 things to clarify here. 1. This was clearly just a landing. No settlement of Filipinos occurred as a result of this landing. 2. There was no Philippines yet at that time. The crew members who were on board were known as Luzones Indios or Indios from Luzon. And 3. There also was no USA then yet. It was because of this recorded landing that the Filipino-American National Historical Society started lobbying in 1992 to have October as Filipino-American History Month. It was in 2009 that the U.S. Congress recognized October as Filipino-American History Month. The first recorded permanent settlement of Filipinos in the United States was in 1763. This means that these men and women from the Philippines were found to be living in America much earlier than the U.S. colonial period in the Philippines, even before the United States colonized the Philippines. Actually, even before there was a United States of America. Remember, the United States declared its independence from the British in 1776. The first Filipinos found living here in America were the Manila men of Louisiana. They lived in 2 settlements. One, the Manila village of the marshlands of the Barataria Bay, and St. Malo on the shore of Lake Borgne in Louisiana. They were believed to be sailors who sailed on vessels plying the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade route. They jumped ship somewhere near the present-day San Diego, California. Remember, in those days, California was part of Mexico. They traveled across the Gulf into Louisiana's Bayou country and settled there. The first organized sanctioned migration of Filipinos to the United States came right after the end of the Philippine-American War in the early 1900s. It was indeed the American colonization of the Philippines that paved the way for the exodus of Filipinos to the United States. The first batch of Filipinos to come to the U.S. were students on government scholarships, the pensionados. The U.S. government hoped that by educating several Filipinos in the U.S., they would be able to mold future leaders of the Philippines loyal to the U.S. The pensionados often were children of rich families and predominantly male. For its inaugural batch, some 20,000 applied. A little over 100 were selected. Not one was female. The first batch left for the U.S. in October 1903. Encouraged by the success of the pensionados, other young Filipinos sought to get education in U.S. schools. From 1910 to 1938, an estimated 14,000 Filipinos sailed to the U.S. as non-sponsored students. They came as laborers. They expected to earn enough money to save up for their U.S. education. The Great Depression of the 1930s, however, forced many self-supporting students to abandon their dreams. They became unintentional migrants and were forced to live out their lives as laborers in the U.S. Pre-World War II Filipinos in Chicago were among these unintentional immigrants. The next wave of Filipinos to come to the U.S. were agricultural workers known as the Manongs. The Manongs came in 1906, just 3 years after the first batch of pensionados left the Philippines. To compare these two waves of migration, the pensionados were educated and came from the middle class, and they came in as government scholars. They came to the U.S. for further studies and training. The Manongs, on the other hand, were poor, who came in as cheap labor for the sugarcane plantations in Hawaii, grape and vegetable farms in California, and the fishing industry in Alaska and Washington State. In the Hawaii experience, plantation owners who largely dependent on the sugar industry needed a steady supply of cheap labor, so they turned to Filipinos. Why Filipinos? Because of the Filipinos' legal status. Filipinos can migrate freely to the U.S. because we, as U.S. colonials, were considered nationals and therefore not subject to immigration ban nor quota. From 1907 to 1924, about 57,700 Filipino workers arrived in Hawaii to work on sugar plantations. By 1932, 70% of plantation workers in Hawaii were Filipinos. During the 1930s, however, clamor for exclusion of Filipinos reduced the flow of Filipino migrants to a trickle. Almost at the same time as the Manong's influx to Hawaii, large-scale Filipino migrations also happening in the U.S. mainland. The 1921 and 1924 immigration laws, which barred Asian immigrants and restricted European immigration, prompted West Coast farms and canneries to turn to Filipinos. By 1930, there were Filipinos all over the U.S. The biggest concentrations were in California, Washington State, Illinois, New York, and Oregon. There were also Filipinos in other states such as Colorado, Kansas, Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Montana, Idaho, Texas, and Arizona. By 1930, there were 30,500 Filipinos in California. Almost all of them came as single young men without families, 80% of whom were from 16 to 30 years old. 60% of Filipinos in the U.S. by this time were agricultural workers. Unlike plantation workers in Hawaii, West Coast Manongs moved with the crops and season. They picked apples in Washington State. They hoed hops in Oregon. They tapped beets in Montana, and they dug potatoes in Idaho. In California, the Manongs pulled carrots, picked strawberries, cut celery, and harvest grapes. And they also worked in asparagus farms. During this time, the Manongs also had to contend with racial discrimination. Local white vigilante groups burned workers' camps and forced strikers to run for their lives. In 1946, Filipino-American immigrant, poet, fiction writer, short storyteller, and activist Carlos Bulosan published America is in the Heart, a semi-autobiographical novel that presented the experiences of Filipino manongs in America in the 1930s. Bulosan, who taught himself how to read and write in English, told the struggles, prejudice, and injustice he and other Filipinos had suffered while in the fisheries of Alaska and Washington State and in the farms of the Pacific Northwest. One of the more famous achievements of Filipino farm workers was the historic Delano Grape Strike of 1965. Filipino farm workers in Delano, California, led by Philip Vera Cruz, Larry Itliong, Benjamin Guinness, and Pete Velasco, started the strike. A week later, the Mexican farm workers group led by Cesar Chavez joined the strike. It took 5 years, but the strike resulted in a victory for farm workers. The workers and major grape growers reached a collective bargaining agreement benefiting more than 10,000 farm workers. Filipinos also toiled in the canneries of the Pacific Northwest and Alaska during summers. Seattle became the hub for Alaskeros, who worked in the salmon canneries in Alaska. Even Filipino students at the University of Washington also worked on the side in canneries. In 1928, there were also 4,000 Filipinos working in Alaska's canneries. In the late 1920s and 1930s, white resentment against Filipino laborers intensified. There are two reasons for this: the growing Filipino population and the Great Depression. They saw Filipinos as stealing their jobs and stealing their women. Between 1928 and 1930, there were several race riots targeting Filipinos, the most notorious of which happened in Watsonville, California, when some 400 white vigilantes attacked a Filipino dance club, beating dozens of Filipinos and killing one. This is where the Tidings-McDuffie law comes into the picture. In 1934, the U.S. Congress yielded to anti-Filipino forces and passed the Tidings-McDuffie law. The law provided for the granting of independence to the Philippines after a 10-year transitional period. It also reclassified all Filipinos living in the United States as aliens and slashed Filipino immigration to 50 persons per year. Even though the Philippines will not become an independent nation until 10 years after the Tidings-McDuffie law was passed, the law automatically withdrew the national status of Filipinos and declared them aliens on the very day the law took effect. The act also paved the way for the Filipino Repatriation Act of 1935. The Filipino Repatriation Act of 1935 was a de facto Filipino deportation law. It empowers the United States government to pressure Filipinos to return to the Philippines. Under the Filipino Repatriation Act, Filipinos are encouraged to live, with the United States government even providing free transportation. These Filipinos would be subjected to the quota system established by the Tidings-McDuffie law of 1934 if they intended to re-enter the United States. Fortunately, the repatriation program was declared unconstitutional in 1940. The next batch of Filipino presence in the U.S. came via the U.S. Navy. As early as 1901, President McKinley ordered the recruitment of 500 Filipinos into the U.S. Navy every year. In 1947, the quota was increased to 1,000 per year. In 1954, the number was raised to 2,000. The number, however, was reduced to 400 a year in 1973. The recruitment of Filipino sailors into the U.S. Navy is the reason why there is a considerable Filipino presence in and around naval bases and depots in the United States, in San Diego, California, in Norfolk, Virginia, and in Jersey City. The next wave of migration are the Filipinos who fought in World War II. In July 1941, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt issued a military order calling into active service of the United States Armed Forces all organized military forces of the Commonwealth of the Philippines. More than 250,000 Filipinos answered the call. In March 1942, the U.S. Congress amended the Nationality Act of 1940 to allow Filipinos who fought in the war to become naturalized U.S. citizens as rewards for their service to the U.S. But the U.S. quickly turned its back on the Filipinos. Here's a timeline of how the United States treated its most loyal ally during the war in the Pacific. June 1944, the U.S. Congress passed the GI Bill of Rights, providing full benefits to all who served irrespective of race, color, or nationality. Under this law, there were 66 countries that were given full benefits. The Filipinos, however, were excluded. February 1946, the U.S. Congress passed the Rescission Act. The act voided the service performed by Filipino veterans under the U.S. flag during World War II. It said that service rendered by Filipinos shall not be deemed active military, naval, or air service for the United States. This effectively denied Filipinos their military benefits. It took 48 years after the 1942 promise of citizenship for the U.S. Congress to go back to its promise. In October 1990, the U.S. Congress passed a law allowing naturalization for those who served in active duty during World War II under the command of the United States Armed Forces in the Far East. Still, U.S. veteran benefits were not included in this legislation. Remember that this came 48 years after the 1942 promise of citizenship. It was in February 2009 when President Barack Obama signed a law authorizing the release of a one-time lump sum payment of $9,000 or $15,000 to eligible World War II Philippine veterans. This came 67 years after the 1942 promise of naturalization. If we divide $15,000 by the number of years the brave Filipino war vets fought during World War II, which is 4 years, then what the veterans got was a measly $10.30 for every day of service. So the Filipino veterans waited for 67 years to be paid $10.30 a day for their military service. As of January 1, 2019, more than 18,000 claims had been approved by the U.S. government, but nearly 24,000 had been denied. As of 2019, less than 10,000 Filipino war veterans were believed to be still alive. Next came the war brides. In June 1946, the Filipino wives of American servicemen stationed in the Philippines during World War II started arriving in the United States. This is the first large-scale migration of Filipino women to the United States. From 1945 to 1965, war brides from all over the world came to America and settled here. Of the estimated 300,000 foreign war brides, more than 51,000 were Filipinos. The Philippines and Japan were the biggest sources of Asian war brides. Filipino spouses who arrived in the United States between 1945 and 1947 came under the terms of this law. The substantial presence of Filipino Americans in the U.S. forces that took the Philippines back from Japanese invaders in 1944 provided an opportunity for many young single Filipino Americans to get married to Filipinas. The passage of the Immigration Act of 1965 was the next major development that led to the next wave of Filipino migration to the U.S. The new immigration law abolished the national origin quotas that had previously hindered migration from foreign countries such as the Philippines. The Immigration Act allowed for relative selective immigration and occupational migration. Under the relative selective immigration, Filipinos who were already in the United States were able to petition their relatives such as spouses, parents, children, and siblings to come to the United States. Under the occupational immigration, the U.S. allows professionals to come in, especially those in specialized high-need professions such as the medical field. This led to the exodus of Filipino doctors, nurses, accountants, engineers, and teachers with their families in tow into the U.S. Most of them settled in the East Coast. Special mention should be made concerning Filipino nurses. Right after the Philippine-American War, the U.S. Army started training Filipinas as volunteer auxiliary and contract nurses to help treat tropical diseases. In 1907, the first nursing school in the Philippines was established by the U.S. colonial government. In 1948, the United States established the Exchange Visitor Program or EVP, an educational exchange service through which students from all over the world came to the U.S. for a 2-year study and leave program. The exchange visitor program, though, is not geared specifically for Filipinos, nor was it created for international nurses. But by the 1960s, 80% of participants of the exchange visitor program were from the Philippines, and majority of whom were nurses. From 1956 to 1969, more than 11,000 nurses participated in the program. The 1965 Immigration Act opened the floodgates even wider. It transformed Filipino nurses coming to America from exchange students to permanent residents. Between 1966 and 1970, more than 3,200 Filipino nurses and more than 2,800 doctors immigrated, according to statistics of the Immigration and Naturalization Services, now the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Still, there were Filipino nurses and doctors that came in through the exchange visitor program. In the same 5-year period from 1966 to 1970, an almost identical number of Filipino nurses and doctors arrived in the U.S. through the exchange visitor program. I hope I was able to answer the question that I posed earlier. I hope I was able to give you an overview of the history of Filipino migration to this country. Thank you and take care. Salamat at ingat.
Noel, thank you for that, though, for laying out the foundation of the Filipino migration. Would you imagine, as I was taking down notes of what you have told us, from the Morro Bay landing to the first batch of immigrants in here, the pensionados, next came the Manons, and then the farm workers, and then the Filipino soldiers, and then the professionals coming from the Philippines. Though I mean, it has taken so many struggles that our kababayans have experienced over the years, though. And thank you for sharing with us a short, history or narrative of how we started as immigrants here in the U.S.
Well, walang anuman, Ricky. It's a pleasure. Thank you also for the opportunity to discuss our history of coming here to the United States, and I think this is my contribution to our community learning our history, especially since October is our month observing Filipino-American history.
Your work as a Filipino historian is very important to all of us, though, and I salute you for sharing your knowledge to us. Before we proceed to our next presenter, we have a very special treat for all of you. It is a rare virtual performance of both Maestro Michael Dadap and Florante Aguilar, performing the lyrical and awe-inspiring Cristina Baliwag. Perhaps this is the most popular Kundiman song during the revolution against Spain. It is also known as the Kundiman ng Himagsikan.
Although the Kundiman Joselinang Baliwag is clearly dedicated to a lady from the town of Baliwag in Bulacan province, it could also be associated with love of country. The image of the forlorn lover pleading to the beloved finds perfect parallel in the Filipino soldiers risking their lives in the battlefield during the 1896 revolution and pleading the cause of liberation from the oppressive Spanish colonialism at the end of the 19th century. Here to perform Joselinang Baliwag is Maestro Michael Dadap and Florante Aguilar.
What a beautiful song it is. Wow. Salamat, Michael Dadap and Florante Aguilar. This pilot episode of Talk of the Town is sponsored by PinoyLife.net, Design District Studios LLC, Cristina Godinez Law Office, and Philippine Daily Mirror. Nair, why don't you introduce our next presenter?
Thank you, Ricky. It will be my pleasure. Our next presenter, Cristina Godinez, is an attorney who families and businesses navigate U.S. immigration and nationality law for over 15 years, while advocating on behalf of highly vulnerable immigrants. Cristina worked with the Immigration Law Office practice group of a top-tier global law firm and later with the world's largest immigration law firm. She is the attorney of the faith-based Migrant Center of New York, where she developed and oversees the delivery of immigration legal services to low-income clients. Cristina is a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. To continue on with the topic of America is in the Heart, let's welcome Cristina Godinez. Cristina, you're on.
I have not been mistaken for someone else as often as I have been in the United States. People think I am Chinese or Korean, and it usually takes at least 3 more guesses before a person finally gets to Filipino. I have been mistaken for a nurse, by doctors no less, who assumed I understood hospital jargon, which I can manage, by the way, because I am the proud older sister to 2 healthcare workers. And there are those awkward self-introductions when the person I meet cannot quite connect my Hispanic name to my Asian face. Has something like this ever happened to you? Is this happening because I am Filipino? In observance of October as Filipino-American History Month, I took to some digital digging. I wanted to find out what's being said about Filipino-Americans and how it matches with what I've experienced as an immigrant and what I have seen as an immigration attorney. I would like to share with you the result of that effort. Today, I will be presenting a statistical snapshot of Filipino immigrants in the U.S., a brief description of the push and pull factors that have been driving Filipino immigration to the U.S., and an exploration of the common issues that confront Filipino immigrants today. A snapshot of Filipino immigrants in America. Although we are present, we are hardly seen. We have been referred to as the forgotten Asian Americans, the invisible minority, the hidden minority, despite the fact that 4.3 million individuals residing in the U.S. were either born in the Philippines or reported Filipino ancestry or race. Yes, a fraction if viewed against the total U.S. population of 327 million. But the Philippines still ranks 4th among the top origin countries for immigrants in the U.S. With 10% of the Filipino population scattered all over the world as overseas contract workers, immigrants, seafarers, it is remarkable that many eventually found their way here, making the U.S. home to the largest number of Filipinos abroad. While it is almost certain that there is a Filipino immigrant in every state of the U.S., most Filipinos reside in California, about 43%. Filipinos predictably settle in areas where job opportunities abound, and a sizable Filipino community already exists. For instance, it might be interesting to note that our top metro areas are Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York, where a third of all Filipinos in the U.S. live. We are a hard-working lot. About 66% of Filipino immigrants participate in the U.S. labor force. This is about the same rate as other immigrants and slightly higher than the 62% of native-born. With significantly higher education rates compared to U.S.-born and other immigrants, Filipinos appear to be well-positioned for upward social and economic mobility. About half of all Filipinos 25 years old and above have at least a bachelor's degree, compared to about a third for US-born and all other immigrants. Households headed by a Filipino immigrant have a median income of $93,000 a year compared to about $60,000 for other immigrant and US-born households. In 2018, Filipino immigrants were less likely to be in poverty than immigrants overall or US-born persons. The pull. U.S. laws that let us in. The 1965 INA removed the national origins quota system that favored European immigrants, supposedly to welcome non-white immigrants like us. The core policy behind the law, however, is family reunification. This means the law prioritizes U.S. citizens who are petitioning for their relatives abroad. Family reunification assured critics of the INA that America will remain predominantly white. After all, 84% of Americans were non-Hispanic whites at the time the INA was passed. Very few would have expected that 55 years later, the U.S. would become more racially diverse, with the non-Hispanic white population now estimated at 59.7%. The Immigration Act, or IM Act of 1990, increased the number of employment-based immigrants admitted each year, but kept the family reunification focus of the 1965 system. It significantly increased the total level of immigration by increasing available visas by 40%. Although employment-related immigration was more than doubled, the 1990 IM Act retained family reunification as the major entry path. In 2018, nearly 81% of Filipinos granted permanent resident status or green cards were petitioned under a family-based visa. In contrast, only 18% of new Filipino immigrants became permanent residents through employment or skills-based petition. Let's take a closer look at Filipino family immigration. Half of Filipino green card holders who are sponsored by family are immediate relatives. Immediate relative visas are granted to spouses, minor children, and parents of U.S. citizens. This category is not subject to annual quotas, so that immigration as immediate relatives is usually faster. On the other hand, a third of Filipino family immigrants were petitioned under what is called family preference categories. These are subject to visa quotas, and they generally make for an extremely slow-moving queue because the yearly quota no longer reflects the high demand for visas. Depending on the family preference subcategory, it could take between 10 to over 20 years for the relatives in the Philippines to obtain their immigrant visas and join their family in the U.S. Filipino immigrant workers are usually petitioned under the EB3 or employment-based third preference category for professionals like accountants, teachers, or engineers, skilled workers like certain IT jobs, and the so-called other skilled workers like home health aides or cooks. Of course, many Filipinos come to the U.S. to work as nurses, but the Philippines is also a major source of allied healthcare professionals like physical therapists, occupational therapists, medical technologists, etc. Nurses and physical therapists are two shortage occupations that have been identified by the U.S. government for fast-track immigration. It is noteworthy that higher categories like the EB2 category for exceptional ability or advanced degree workers and EB1 for extraordinary ability individuals, outstanding professors or researchers, or multinational managers are underutilized among Filipino immigrants. Many Filipinos come to the United States on temporary visas, like the B1, B2 for visitors, F1 for students, the J1 for exchange visitors, or temporary worker visas like the H1B for professionals or the O1 for extraordinary ability workers. Those who come under these visas are required to leave the U.S. at the end of their authorized stay based on their visa type. In 2018, the Department of Homeland Security reported that there were about 500,000 non-immigrant admissions from the Philippines. About 72% of this were tourists, and 3% represented students, and another 3% represented temporary workers. Filipinos who enter as tourists usually apply for an extension or for a change of non-immigrant status in order to stay in the U.S. longer. Depending on their specific circumstances, including potential family or employer sponsorship, Filipinos who are here on temporary visas may eventually apply to adjust their status into permanent residence and obtain their green cards without leaving the U.S. The push. Conditions at home that forced us out. The laggard Philippine economy spawned the labor export policy that is forcing more and more Filipinos out. For the past 50 years, the Philippine government has been the biggest overseas deployment agency for Filipino workers. As early as the 1970s, when foreign currency loans grew under the Marcos dictatorship, the Philippine government built a systematic program for sending Filipinos abroad to help pay off foreign debt and cope with widespread unemployment. In 1974, just 2 years after martial law was declared, Marcos laid the groundwork for the large-scale deployment of Filipino workers. He issued Presidential Decree 944, the Philippine Labor Code. The law centralized recruitment and overseas placement and mandated the remittance of a portion of Filipinos' foreign exchange earnings to the Philippines. This was followed by laws and policies that promoted the deployment of Filipino workers through government-regulated channels, particularly through the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration, or POEA, which was created in 1982. What was initially intended to be a temporary fix for foreign debt servicing and unemployment during the Marcos dictatorship became a perpetual fixture of Philippine economic policy to this day. In real terms, the Philippine government institutionalized labor export policy. This is evident from the core functions of the POEA listed here in order of importance: industry regulation, employment facilitation, worker protection, support services. Remittance from Filipino workers worldwide account for 10% of the Philippines' total gross domestic product. The Philippines ranks fourth among the largest destination countries for overseas worker remittances, next to India, China, and Mexico. Filipino immigrants in the U.S. contribute the largest chunk, close to 40% of the total remittances. Despite the Duterte government's pledge to bring Filipino migrant workers home, there is no indication that the Philippine economy is ready to abandon its labor export policy. To this day, there are as many disincentives to remain in the Philippines as there are reasons to depart, preferably for the U.S. Filipino professionals and skilled workers often look to America as a place where they can find the financial stability and career advancement that the Philippines could not provide. A cursory review of average annual salaries online clearly show that Filipino workers could earn 10 times more in the U.S. for the same work done in the Philippines. A nurse, for instance, typically earns about $8,000 per year in the metro areas of the Philippines. In contrast, the average salary of a nurse in the U.S. is about $78,000 per year. A physician earns about $11,000 a year in the Philippines. In the U.S., the average annual earnings of a physician is about $200,000. For Filipinos who are unemployed or underemployed, it is hard to turn a blind eye to job opportunities in the U.S. Many occupations traditionally filled by Filipinos have been identified by the U.S. government as among the top 20 fastest-growing occupations for 2019 to 2029. Nurse practitioners, occupational therapy assistants, statisticians, home health and personal care aides, physical therapist assistants, medical and health services managers, physician assistants, information security analysts, speech-language pathologists, restaurant cooks. Filipino immigrants face recurring issues that arise from the push and pull factors that drive our immigration to the U.S. In a 2013-2017 study by the nonprofit group Polaris and the National Domestic Workers Alliance, the Philippines was identified as the top source country for labor trafficking, followed by Mexico. The study also found that the overwhelming majority of victims are female. Financial control and misrepresentation were the main methods of control. Visitor visas, diplomatic support staff visas, exchange visitor, and student visas were used to bring in victims. Filipino immigrants as frontline workers. Immigrant workers from the Philippines in particular are among the largest contingents of frontline workers in the U.S. They comprise 4% of registered nurses in the U.S. and have suffered casualties in the front lines as the COVID-19 pandemic rages on. According to the National Nurses United, the largest organization of nurses in the U.S., 1/3 of the nurses who died of COVID-19 and related complications were Filipino. While there are family immigration cases that end up happily ever after in the U.S., there are also several cases of Filipino immigrants who become victims of domestic abuse. Anecdotal reports suggest a spike in domestic violence cases across the board due to the pressures of locking down during the COVID-19 pandemic. Access to social and psychological support as well as legal services remains a challenge, even as U.S. immigration law provides relief for battered spouses, children, and parents. Most undocumented Filipinos are individuals who have overstayed their visas. This means they initially had permission to enter and stay in the U.S. for a specific period, but failed to leave when their authorized period of stay expired. Estimates suggest that there are about 300,000 undocumented Filipinos in the U.S., or about 3% of the estimated 11 million unauthorized population. Filipinos typically have better options for immigration relief than other undocumented persons who enter the U.S. without a visa or who have other immigration violations or criminal history. A common situation is that undocumented Filipinos usually belong to mixed status families, those whose family members include U.S. citizens, permanent residents, or temporary visa holders. Under the current restrictive environment, this has caused family displacement and anxiety within immigrant communities. In closing, allow me to borrow a quote from one of the more visible undocumented Filipinos, Jose Antonio Vargas. Vargas, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, filmmaker, book author, and immigration rights advocate, wrote an op-ed in 2015 exploring why Filipino-Americans so enthusiastically embrace boxer Manny Pacquiao. He wrote, "For Filipino-Americans, it's a battle for recognition, for identity in a culture where, for the mainstream, Asians tend to fade into a monochromatic racialized other. It has been said more than once that Filipino immigrants are so good at assimilating, fading out as Filipinos in hopes that we can come forward and be seen as Americans. Perhaps that's why we're hidden, invisible, or worse, forgotten. Hopefully, by taking the time to look and reflect upon our long journey as immigrants, we honor our history and heritage because there are those who came before us who refused to fade out. Farm worker union leaders Larry Itliong and Philip Vera Cruz, marriage equality activist Richard Frank Adams, civil rights and labor leaders Silme Domingo and Jean Viernes, and keeper of the Filipino-American story, historian Dr. Fred Cordova. They all stood out to proudly claim our place as Filipino-Americans.
Noel has actually traced our history beginning in the 1800s. Uh, Filipinos have really experienced a lot of struggles now, from beating of white farmers, while they are enjoying themselves in a dance club or a dance bar. Up to now, we experienced that, and no wonder that even our own country, in the Philippines, I'm surprised to know that the POEA was used as an instrument to pay off government debts. So imagine that. It was meant to be a temporary fix, and now it became permanent, and a lot more labor from the Philippines are being exported to the USA. In fact, but the thing is that they are also prone to labor trafficking. There's a lot of information here that we could actually digest and learn from. And I hope that our viewers pick up something on this one, that our journey as Filipino-Americans here in the US, we learn from it. And so thank you, Noel and Chris.
You're welcome. I'd be happy to answer questions if there are any from our participants. The whole idea is for us to be able to start a conversation about our experience as Filipino-Americans, and we can start, with questions from the presentation, and let us know if there's anything that needs to be clarified.
Yes, I saw some questions in the chat box, and we have received some texted in questions. The first question is for Noel, and this comes from Sunny out in Jersey City. And the question is, Professor Noel, what would have happened if Filipinos at the time when there was no USA yet were authorized to stay put? Would the Philippines have become a state of the US?
Hi, Ricky. I'm a bit confused with the time frame when there was no USA yet. So who was to give the immigration status to Filipinos here in the Americas, right? Maybe the question is about the time when the 1934 Tidings McDuffie law took away the national status of the Filipinos,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
For me, it's hard to deal with the should have, could have, would have. I mean, it's hard to know. The thing is, the Tidings McDuffie Act taking away the status of the Filipino as nationals was actually a result of the pressure against Filipino presence in the United States. So there's a strong opposition to that. So I guess that was really something that in a way is bound to happen given the anti-Filipino sentiments at the time. Now also, I guess because there was a time that the Philippines as a colony of the United States, we were considered nationals. I think that also gave rise to a movement in the Philippines that calls for our statehood in the United States. I think until now, the Philippine statehood movement to the United States is still pretty much around in the Philippines.
There's another question in here, and this one is from Gary from Queens, and says, Professor Noel, can you tell me more about the Delano grape strike of 1965?
Okay, the Delano grape workers strike of 1965. The farm workers at that time, they were demanding for one, of course, better pay, and secondly, better working conditions. The thing is, before 1965, the workers were divided along nationality or cultural lines. Like, for example, there's a farm workers group of Filipinos, there's a farm workers group of predominantly Mexicans. So what happened before was that when Filipino workers would go on strike, right? The plantation, no, the how do you call them? The farm owners, right? They would just hire more Mexican workers to take over the jobs done by the Filipinos and pay the Mexicans more, right? And if the Mexicans go on strike, they would hire the Filipinos as scabs to take over the jobs of the Mexicans and give them better pay. So in 1965, Larry Itliong and Philip Vera Cruz thought that this is not going to work. If you're going to strike, we need the support of the Mexican farm workers. So they approached Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and asked them to join the strike. At that time, the Filipinos already were on strike. So a week later, they went to Cesar Chavez and asked him to join. But Cesar Chavez said, no, I still need 2 years. But then eventually, Larry Itliong was able to convince Cesar Chavez to put the strike to a vote. And the Mexican farm workers unanimously voted to join the Filipinos in strike. Now, this is a victory because this is the first time that farm workers exhibited an international solidarity for a common cause. This is the first, I would say, international solidarity of farm workers. Although it took 5 years, but the farm workers of Delano, they were able to get their demand. The farm workers and the farm owners eventually signed a collective bargaining agreement. So this is a historic strike, a historic movement, and the Filipinos were the ones who started it, mga promotor.
Yeah, and I understand, Noel, that it's about 2 or 3 years ago, the efforts of Larry Leong was actually recognized and acknowledged. I think in San Jose, they have now a school named after Larry Leong, isn't it?
Yeah. I think it's Philip Vera Cruz and Larry Itliong Elementary School or middle schools somewhere in California. And it's also one school district or one city already has a curriculum to study as part of history, the contributions of the Filipino farm workers, specifically Larry Itliong and Philip Vera Cruz.
Wow. So at least for now, I mean, the Filipinos are being, the contributions of Filipinos in the labor movement, is being recognized. Nair, would you have some questions there?
Oh, yeah. Actually, I was just going to interject. This probably will go to Chris because it's a current. It's more related to the times now. It's a two-part question. First part is, are nurses and other healthcare workers from the Philippines still coming to the U.S. despite the pandemic? And will immigration laws change after the elections? I think Chris can answer that.
Sure, I'll be happy to. With regard to nurses, yes, nurses can continue processing their visas to come to the United States, despite the announcement of President Trump to suspend visa processing up until December 31, 2020. That particular announcement of President Trump was supposedly intended to protect the American public from the entry of more workers that might take away jobs at a time when many have lost their jobs because of the pandemic. So the government basically recognized the need for more healthcare workers to fight COVID-19, and the announcement of President Trump actually carved out an exception for nurses so they can continue processing their immigrant visa or temporary visas to come to the United States and help with the fight against COVID-19. With regard to what the elections will bring us, I believe we're still in the middle of finding out what the results are. A lot of my colleagues in the legal field will say, well, let's wait for Friday. Let's wait until tomorrow to find out whether we make a move or not. But the agenda ahead is still very clear. We need to change immigration laws. We need comprehensive immigration reform because the system right now is broken in so many places. It does not reflect the reality that there is more global mobility, and the system right now does not respond to the needs of the American economy. So we need to step back and re-examine what needs to be fixed, and it's a big job that requires cooperation from both sides of the aisle. And your guess is as good as mine as to whether that's going to happen, because this has been an advocacy for more than a decade already among the Filipino community. So let's hope for the best. So probably we'll find out, we'll have a clearer picture tomorrow.
Thank you, Chris. Follow-up question I got there from Jose from Briarwood. I think it's about your talk earlier. What immigration reliefs are available to a Filipino worker who is a victim of human trafficking?
Okay, so it always depends on what particular facts are availing in the case. But in general, a person who is trafficked may avail of an application for a T visa. That allows a person to stay here and help with the prosecution of the persons who committed human trafficking. There's also the U visa, which is available to persons who also help with the prosecution of certain qualifying crimes, and certain activities in trafficking rings would actually qualify for that U visa. Both the T and the U visa can entitle the visa holder to a green card after a certain number of years. Sometimes trafficking also occurs in the context of the bringing in of domestic workers. That could also be a potential case for a T or a U visa, and sometimes in the context of domestic abuse, where the intimate partner is actually causing or creating circumstances that would eventually render the foreigner qualified for benefits under what's called the Violence Against Women Act, which is actually available not just to women but to anybody in an intimate relationship. So that's probably something that needs to be evaluated further.
There, I have this. I think this is very relevant question, though. I got about 3 questions in here, but I just summarize it. And that question is that can the Filipino spouse of a gay U.S. citizen apply for a green card? I think this is addressed to Cristina again.
Oh yes. Right now there is the U.S. laws already acknowledge and recognize marriage equality. So in a same-sex relationship, the immigration benefits that are available in between husband and wife is also available to same-sex spouses. So there really is no difference anymore. A gay couple can apply for immigration benefits.
Oh, that's interesting, though. No wonder I got 3 questions about it, though.
This one I don't, probably Noel and Chris answer this. It says, why do you think that despite the Filipinos' big population here in the U.S., the Filipino-Americans not have a strong political clout?
You want to start?
Noel or Chris?
Okay, yeah. I think that's a question that's for all of us to answer.
Yeah.
I mean, we are, as I said, and also Chris said, we are the fourth largest immigrant group in the United States. But despite that fact, we haven't had a big political clout, a big political say in the political life and the decisions in the United States. But I think slowly now we are seeing slow but steady surge, not surge, but strong and steady the development within the Filipino-American community, wherein Filipinos are now becoming more active in politics, campaigning for this and that presidential candidate or local congressional or senatorial candidates, and even running for political offices.
Yes.
I think we're slowly coming out of our coming out under the rock and also, I mean, if you notice, there's also more and more Filipinos making names in the entertainment and sports in industry. So I think, yeah, we're on our way, but still a long way to go. But we are slowly getting there. I hope.
Yeah, if I may add to what Noel has said a while ago, though, I think you're correct, Noel, because as of now, I think about 2 months ago, a group of Filipino-Americans, though, organized what we call as the Filipino-Americans National Financial Council. And the purpose of that is actually to help Filipino-American candidates in the future, though. And I think they already have set a goal for that one. And in fact, they're trying to support about just this recently. There's about close to 50 Filipino-Americans who ran for office. And because we have two right now in Congress, TJ Cox and Scott from Virginia.
Oh.
Yeah. So there?
Yeah. I think we are about
Chris.
out of time. But do we have time for one more question? Ricky, do you have one last question maybe?
Oh, can we still take that? Okay. All right. I have one in here, but it's more of a historical question, though, which I think this one goes to Noel.
Okay.
I have heard about the Nueva Filipinas of Cuba and Nuevas Filipinas of Texas. Can you tell us more about this? I haven't heard about it.
Okay. Yeah, sure. There's a place in Cuba that was used to be known as Nueva Filipinas. It was renamed Pinar del Rio in 1774. The city and province were originally founded by the Spanish as Nueva Filipinas. That's the original name of the town. It was because due to the influx of Filipinos who arrived from the Manila galleons. Remember the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, and Cuba was on the way. It's a stopover point. And there were Filipino sailors on the galleon ships who later decided to settle in Cuba, in this part of Cuba. They said that these Filipinos brought with them some palok or tamarind to Cuba, the camisa de chino that we know, the shirt with 3 buttons, and then also the arroz caldo, which the Cubans called arroz caldoso. The Filipinos there in Cuba were known as Chinos Manila, right? But in 1774, when it was renamed Pinar del Rio, many of the Filipinos moved to the Chinatown called the big Chinatown, and then some of them eventually moved. Guess what? Louisiana. In Barataria Bay and in St. Malo. One thing fascinating about this Nueva Filipinas in Cuba, the Cuban cigar, the famous Cuban cigar that we know today, was initially produced in the Philippines, in the haciendas in Ilocos, owned by the Tabacalera. Eventually, when Mexico became independent, the Tabacalera moved its operation from the Philippines to Cuba, and with that, Tabacalera brought, the famous La Flor de Isabela, the famous cigar, to Cuba, and it was in Cuba that it became famous now worldwide. The other one is the Nuevas Filipinas in Texas. This is much earlier, 1716. What happened was there was this Franciscan missionary who explored that part of the United States in Texas. So the large part of Texas, he called it Nuevas Filipinas, and he wrote a letter to the Viceroy of Mexico to say that this founding or this discovery is as big as the founding of the Philippines. So they called it Nuevas Filipinas. So up until the end of the 18th century, that part of Texas, or probably the whole of Texas, was known as Nuevas Filipinas. There are still government documents saying that it's Nuevas Filipinas, but probably the name did not catch on for long. So eventually, what remained was that it was known as Texas. But the thing is, there is no proof that there was even one single Filipino who ever lived in Nuevas Filipinas in Texas. So it's just a name.
Wow, that's really a very interesting anecdote in there, that even before this tobaccos, the tobaccos from Cuba, it originated in the Ilocos. Now, there's a question from our friend in here, our guest performer, Michael Dadap, and the question is directed to Cristina. Is there an organization to help abused women by their American spouses?
Yes, there is an organization. I work at a church-based migrant center. We do help survivors of domestic abuse. I can provide you the contact information offline. And there are organizations that provide social services. So we can probably talk about that later. So any person who is any foreigner in the United States who is suffering domestic abuse in the hands of a U.S. citizen or green card holder spouse or parent can avail of the immigration relief under the Violence Against Women Act and may be able to apply for a green card without the sponsorship of the abusive spouse or parent.
Wow. All right. I think we're running out of time, right, Nair?
We just wanted to greet a couple of people who were very historical because they were part of our pilot episode. John Pasamonte, thank you for viewing. Of course, Maestro Michael Dadap. We have Jocelyn Bernal, Lito Torres Balatbat, Vivian Velasco, Annie Ortiz. Maraming salamat sa inyo for tuning in. And I guess, are we out of time or?
Yes.
Yeah, we're out of time. So Ricky.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Nair. All right. To Cristina and to Noel, thank you for joining us in our pilot episode of Talk of the Town. I mean, I'm sure that our viewers have had a lot of information that they can take away from this program tonight. And I also hope that we were able to inspire and enlighten our viewers. We are now currently prepping up for our next episodes. So please stay tuned to Talk of the Town only on PinoyLife.net, your web channel for lifestyle and knowledge sharing. Thank you once again, Noel and Chris, for being such great presenters. Would you have any parting words for our viewers?
For me, it's always a pleasure, to discuss Filipino-American history or even Philippine history. I know we might have answered some questions, but I know that we might have actually helped spur more questions. So I hope this would be, as Chris said earlier, this could be the start of a running conversation about our history, Filipino-American history and Philippine history. So yeah, I hope we can see each other soon and talk about more about Philippine history. Salamat Ricky, salamat Ner for the opportunity.
And Chris?
Maraming salamat. Thank you for the opportunity to share information about current immigration laws and policies. And I hope that this will spur the Filipino community to have a louder voice in the in the struggle to actually come up with comprehensive immigration reform now that we are at the cusp of a big political change. Whichever way this goes, we have a voice in this, and hopefully the Filipino community can come together. Thank you for this chance.
Thank you. And I hope that, we could have answered more questions though, but we're running out of time really. And I would just like to, give a shout out to someone who is a big part of this production tonight. And I'd like to call on Ralph Samson, our technical director. Ralph?
Hi, Ricky. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we here at Design District Studios LLC are privileged and proud to be part of this endeavor. And with PinoyLife, and this is a great platform to increase the visibility of topics, news, and events that are relevant to our Filipino-American community. And we encourage everyone to come be part of the PinoyLife bandwagon. And again, congratulations to Talk of the Town and our guest for the pilot episode, Professor Noel Pangilinan. And also Attorney Cristina Godinez on behalf of my colleague Antero Martinez and Jay Acuña here at Design District Studios. We would like to say mabuhay and maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Ralph. And thank you, Noel and Chris. If you have any suggestions on the topics and content and how to get on our show, please email us at PinoyLife1020@gmail.com. We are looking forward to seeing you in our upcoming episodes.
Yes, that is correct. Please like our FB page, our Facebook page, and check in regularly to see our upcoming episode schedule. This has been a super pilot episode for our web series, Talk of the Town, and on behalf of our host and moderator, Ricky Rillera, and the staff and crew of PinoyLife.net, this is Antero Martinez, bidding you all a good night, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be around the globe. Seize the day and make it a great one. See you next time. Keep talking.